The sun rises over the South China Sea on a morning that looks like any other. But beneath the calm surface of these disputed waters, something extraordinary is unfolding. A Chinese Type 095 nuclear attack submarine glides silently through the depths, its sonar operators tracking the distinctive acoustic signature of an American carrier strike group centered around the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built. Above the waves, F-35C fighter jets launch from the carrier's deck in routine patrol patterns, their pilots unaware that they are being shadowed not just by the submarine below, but by a constellation of Chinese surveillance satellites passing overhead every 90 minutes. This is not war, not yet, but it is the opening frame of a question that will define the 21st century. Can the United States of America, the undisputed global superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union, sustain its military dominance in an era when rivals are closing the gap? Technology is democratizing warfare and the very nature of power is being rewritten? The Carrier Strike Group continues its freedom of navigation operation, a demonstration of American resolve and capability. But intelligence analysts in both Washington and Beijing know that this ritual of power projection is becoming more contested with each passing year. The question is not whether America remains the strongest military force on Earth today, because by nearly every conventional metric it does, but whether the systems, strategies, and resources that built this dominance can be maintained against adversaries who are investing heavily, innovating rapidly, and exploiting American vulnerabilities in ways that previous generations of competitors never could. To understand whether American military dominance is sustainable, we must first comprehend the extraordinary scope of what the United States has built over the past 8 decades. The American military apparatus is not merely the world's largest armed force, it is a global system of power projection unmatched in human history. The United States maintains approximately 750 military installations across 80 countries, a network of bases that allows American forces to reach any point on the globe within hours. The nuclear triad remains the foundation of strategic deterrence, with 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines prowling the oceans in secrecy, each carrying 24 Trident II missiles, with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, capable of striking hundreds of targets with yields ranging from 5 to 475 kilotons. The land-based leg consists of 400 Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles buried in hardened silos across Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, each ready to launch within minutes of a presidential order. The air component deploys a fleet of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and aging B-52 Stratofortresses, soon to be joined by the new B-21 Raider, a stealth bomber designed to penetrate the most advanced air defenses well into the 2050s. This triad is undergoing a modernization program expected to cost more than $1.2 trillion over the next 3 decades, replacing aging systems with new technologies designed to maintain strategic overmatch against any conceivable combination of adversaries. The Columbia-class submarine will replace the Ohio boats with enhanced stealth and payload capacity. The ground-based strategic deterrent will replace the Minuteman III with modern solid-fuel missiles and updated command and control systems. The modernization program represents the largest recapitalization of America's nuclear forces since the Cold War, a recognition that deterrence requires not just capability, but the visible commitment to maintain that capability across generations. American naval power extends far beyond nuclear submarines. The United States Navy operates 11 supercarriers, more than the rest of the world combined, each one a floating airbase capable of projecting overwhelming force thousands of miles from American shores. The newest Ford-class carriers incorporate electromagnetic catapults that can launch aircraft more rapidly and efficiently than the steam catapults of earlier designs, sortie rates that could prove decisive in sustained combat operations. Surrounding each carrier is a strike group typically comprising guided missile cruisers armed with Aegis combat systems capable of tracking and engaging hundreds of targets simultaneously, destroyers equipped with vertical launch systems carrying Tomahawk cruise missiles and anti-air interceptors, and attack submarines providing underwater protection and offensive strike capability. The Navy's distributed maritime operations concept envisions a future fleet of more than 500 ships, including unmanned surface and underwater vessels that would extend the sensor and weapons range of manned platforms while reducing risk to personnel. The current fleet stands at just under 300 ships, a number that reflects decades of prioritizing quality over quantity, but also reveals a troubling trend. American shipbuilding capacity has atrophied dramatically since the Cold War, with only a handful of yards capable of constructing major warships and production timelines stretching across years or even decades. China, by contrast, has the world's largest shipbuilding industry and has been launching major combatants at a rate that will give it a larger navy than the United States by the end of this decade in terms of hull count, though not yet in terms of overall tonnage or capability. The naval power competition is not simply about numbers, but about the ability to sustain and replace losses. And here the advantage that America enjoyed for generations is eroding. Air superiority has been the cornerstone of American military doctrine since the Second World War, and the United States Air Force remains technologically dominant, with a fleet that includes the F-22 Raptor, the world's first fifth-generation air superiority fighter, and the F-35 Lightning II, a multi-role stealth fighter being produced in numbers that will make it the backbone of American and Allied air power for decades. The combination of stealth, advanced sensors, and network-centric warfare capabilities allows American pilots to see adversaries before being seen, engage from beyond visual range, and operate in contested environments where earlier generation aircraft would face catastrophic losses. Strategic bombers provide global strike capability, able to deliver conventional or nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth with minimal notice. Air refueling tankers extend the range of combat aircraft to unlimited distances, a capability no other nation can match at scale. Transport aircraft, including the C-17 Globemaster and C-5 Galaxy, move troops and equipment across continents with speed and volume that underpins America's ability to project power globally. Yet air superiority is no longer the uncontested domain it once was. China has developed its own fifth-generation fighters, including the J-20 and J-31, aircraft that, while not equivalent to American platforms, represent a significant advancement over earlier generations and will be produced in large numbers. More concerning is the proliferation of advanced air defense systems, particularly Russian S-400 and Chinese HQ-9 systems that can detect and engage stealth aircraft at ranges that make traditional air operations risky and costly. The future of air dominance may depend less on individual aircraft performance and more on the integration of manned and unmanned systems, artificial intelligence-enabled decision-making, and the ability to operate in environments where the electromagnetic spectrum is as contested as the physical airspace. Space has become the newest domain of military competition, and the establishment of the United States Space Force in 2019 recognized what military planners have known for decades. Modern warfare is utterly dependent on satellites for communication, navigation, reconnaissance, and missile warning. The Global Positioning System provides position, navigation, and timing data that underpins everything from precision-guided munitions to commercial aviation and financial transactions. Reconnaissance satellites provide imagery and signals intelligence that allows commanders to track enemy movements and assess battle damage in near real time. Communication satellites link forces scattered across the globe into coherent networks capable of coordinated operations. Early warning satellites detect missile launches within seconds, providing the critical minutes needed to assess threats and mount responses. All of these systems are vulnerable. China and Russia have both developed anti-satellite weapons, including kinetic kill vehicles that can physically destroy satellites, ground-based lasers that can blind or damage satellite sensors, and cyber weapons that can interfere with satellite operations or corrupt the data they transmit. In 2007, China demonstrated the ability to destroy a satellite with a ground-launched missile, creating a cloud of debris that will threaten space operations for decades. Russia has tested co-orbital anti-satellite systems that can maneuver close to target satellites and destroy them with minimal warning. The United States has developed its own anti-satellite capabilities and is investing in satellite resilience, including proliferated constellations of smaller satellites that would be harder to target comprehensively. But the fundamental vulnerability remains. A future conflict between major powers might begin not with missiles or aircraft, but with attacks on space-based infrastructure that would blind forces, disrupt communications, and degrade precision strike capabilities. The side that can fight effectively while denied space-based assets may hold a decisive advantage. Cyber warfare represents perhaps the most revolutionary change in military affairs since the advent of nuclear weapons, because it allows nations to attack critical infrastructure, degrade military capabilities, and even influence political processes without ever firing a shot in the conventional sense. The United States Cyber Command operates with a mission to defend military networks, conduct offensive cyber operations, and support combatant commanders with cyber capabilities integrated into traditional military operations. American cyber capabilities are believed to be the most advanced in the world, able to penetrate adversary networks, disrupt command and control systems, and manipulate data in ways that could prove decisive in conflict. The Stuxnet operation against Iran's nuclear program demonstrated the potential of cyber weapons to achieve strategic effects without kinetic warfare. Yet cyber is also a domain where the barriers to entry are lower than traditional military capabilities, where non-state actors can punch above their weight, and where attribution and escalation management are extraordinarily complex. Russia has demonstrated sophisticated cyber capabilities through operations against Ukraine's power grid, American political institutions, and commercial entities across the West. China has conducted extensive cyber espionage campaigns, stealing military and commercial technology worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and accelerating its own military modernization by decades. North Korea has used cyber operations to fund its regime and conduct harassment operations against adversaries. Iran has developed offensive cyber capabilities despite having a relatively unsophisticated traditional military. The democratization of cyber capabilities means that future conflicts may involve not just nation-states, but criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and even individuals capable of inflicting strategic damage. The United States has advantages in cyber warfare, but lacks the decisive overmatch it enjoys in traditional domains. And defensive cyber operations are inherently more difficult than offensive operations because attackers need only find one vulnerability, while defenders must protect against countless possible attack vectors. The network of alliances that the United States has built since World War II represents a force multiplier that no rival can match. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization binds 32 nations across North America and Europe in a collective defense pact that deters aggression and provides interoperability that allows coalition operations on a scale impossible for any other group of nations. Treaty alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines anchor American presence in the Indo-Pacific and complicate any potential Chinese military adventurism by ensuring that aggression would face not just American forces, but a coalition of wealthy, technologically advanced democracies. Security partnerships with nations across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America provide access, intelligence sharing, and cooperative operations that extend American influence into regions where permanent military presence is limited. These alliances are simultaneously America's greatest strategic asset and a potential vulnerability. Allied nations contribute forces, bases, and legitimacy to American-led operations, but they also constrain American freedom of action through requirements for consultation and consensus. European allies have allowed their military capabilities to atrophy during decades of peace, and now face difficult decisions about defense spending and force structure as Russian aggression has returned. Asian allies face difficult balancing acts between security relationships with the United States and economic relationships with China, creating potential fractures that Chinese diplomacy works to exploit. The reliability of American alliances depends not just on treaty obligations, but on the perception that the United States has both the capability and the will to honor its commitments. And recent years have seen both adversaries and allies questioning whether American security guarantees will hold in moments of crisis. If allies doubt American resolve, deterrence weakens and the calculus of potential aggressors shifts in dangerous directions. Industrial capacity is often overlooked in analyses of military power, but may prove decisive in any sustained great power conflict. The United States possesses the world's largest economy with a gross domestic product exceeding $27 trillion, providing enormous resources for defense spending. But size alone does not guarantee the ability to produce the weapons, ammunition, and equipment needed for sustained high-intensity warfare. The American defense industrial base has consolidated dramatically over recent decades, with just a handful of prime contractors dominating major weapon systems and supply chains that span the globe in complex networks vulnerable to disruption. Ammunition production provides a sobering example of the gap between peacetime production capacity and wartime requirements. When the United States began providing artillery ammunition to Ukraine following Russia's invasion, stockpiles depleted more rapidly than production could replace them, forcing investments in expanded production capacity that will take years to come fully online. The annual production rate of artillery shells stood at approximately 14,000 rounds per month before the war in Ukraine, a fraction of what Ukrainian forces were firing in a matter of days. Plans to increase production to 100,000 rounds per month by 2025 represent significant progress, but still fall short of what would be consumed in a major conflict involving American forces. Missile production faces similar constraints with precision-guided munitions, air defense interceptors, and cruise missiles produced in quantities sufficient for limited operations but potentially inadequate for sustained high-intensity conflict against a peer adversary. Shipbuilding capacity has already been discussed, but bears repeating because the ability to replace losses matters as much as the forces available at the start of a conflict. China can build warships faster and in greater numbers than the United States, a reversal of the industrial advantages that allowed America to overwhelm opponents in previous conflicts. The demographic challenge facing American military dominance is less visible than industrial or technological factors, but potentially more fundamental. The all-volunteer force has served the nation well for 5 decades, providing professional, capable, and experienced military personnel, but recruiting has become increasingly difficult as a smaller percentage of young Americans are both qualified and interested in military service. Obesity, drug use, mental health issues, and lack of physical fitness disqualify large numbers of potential recruits. The strong civilian economy means that military service must compete with better paying and less demanding employment options. Declining trust in institutions, including the military, makes service less attractive to demographics that traditionally provided the bulk of recruits. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan stretched the force thin, with repeated deployments that took a toll on retention and family stability. Currently, the services are meeting recruiting goals only through extraordinary incentives and by lowering standards in some categories, raising questions about whether a force sized for global dominance can be sustained through voluntary enlistment alone. The alternative of conscription is politically impossible in the current American context and would undermine the professionalism that has made the all-volunteer force so effective. But without conscription, the military must compete for talent in a marketplace where it increasingly struggles. Adversaries face different demographic challenges, with China's working-age population beginning to decline due to decades of the one-child policy and Russia suffering from a demographic collapse that may prove catastrophic within a generation. But the common factor is that all major powers will field smaller militaries relative to their populations than in previous eras, potentially making advanced technology and economic capacity even more important than raw numbers of personnel. To assess whether American military dominance is sustainable requires looking beyond current capabilities to examine the trajectory of technological, economic, and geopolitical trends that will shape the strategic environment in the coming decades. The first scenario involves a crisis over Taiwan beginning in the year 2027. Chinese President Xi Jinping has made reunification with Taiwan a central goal of his tenure, and American intelligence agencies have warned that the People's Liberation Army may achieve the capability to attempt an invasion by the middle of this decade. In this scenario, a political crisis in Taiwan leads to Beijing deciding that the window for peaceful reunification has closed, and that military action is necessary to prevent permanent separation. The operation begins not with an amphibious assault, but with a comprehensive campaign to isolate Taiwan from the outside world. Chinese cyber attacks disrupt communications networks, financial systems, and government operations across the island. Anti-satellite weapons degrade American reconnaissance and communication satellites, creating gaps in situational awareness that American commanders depend upon. Ballistic and cruise missiles rain down on Taiwanese air bases, ports, and air defense sites in the opening hours, attempting to destroy the ability to resist before ground forces even embark. Chinese naval forces, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, establish a blockade preventing ships from reaching Taiwanese ports. Chinese Air Force fighters and bombers suppress Taiwanese air defenses and establish air superiority over the strait. The amphibious assault, when it comes, involves not just traditional landing craft, but a fleet of civilian roll-on roll-off ferries, fishing boats, and merchant ships impressed into military service to move hundreds of thousands of troops across the strait despite heavy losses. The United States faces an immediate decision with global implications. American forces in Japan and Guam come under missile attack from Chinese rocket forces, attempting to crater runways and destroy aircraft before they can intervene. The carrier strike groups in the Western Pacific face salvos of anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles, weapons specifically designed to target American carriers and capable of overwhelming defensive systems through sheer numbers. American submarines attempt to interdict Chinese naval forces and supply lines, but must operate in shallow, heavily defended waters where Chinese anti-submarine warfare capabilities are strongest. The Air Force struggles to operate from bases within range of Chinese missiles, while tanker aircraft needed to refuel fighters become priority targets for Chinese long-range air defenses and fighter patrols. The United States possesses superior technology and better trained personnel, but China enjoys the advantage of proximity, operating from interior lines with vast inventories of missiles and the industrial capacity to replace losses far more rapidly than America can. The Taiwan scenario unfolds over weeks and months rather than hours and days, because modern warfare between peer competitors involves not just the clash of arms, but the erosion of will through sustained attrition and the exploitation of political divisions. American forces inflict heavy losses on Chinese naval and air forces, sinking multiple amphibious vessels and shooting down dozens of aircraft. But Chinese forces continue to press forward, accepting casualties that would be politically impossible for the United States. The American public watches in real time as casualties mount, as the costs of the conflict soar into hundreds of billions of dollars, and as shortages of critical munitions raise questions about how long the fight can be sustained. Allied support proves mixed with Japan providing bases and logistical support, but stopping short of direct combat involvement. South Korea concerned about North Korean opportunism and Chinese economic retaliation, limiting its participation, and European allies expressing solidarity, but offering little concrete military assistance to a conflict 8,000 miles away. China, meanwhile, frames the conflict as purely internal, a civil war in which foreign intervention is illegitimate, and wages an influence campaign to divide American domestic opinion and weaken international support for intervention. The nuclear dimension hangs over every decision because both the United States and China possess nuclear weapons capable of devastating each other's homeland, creating a ladder of escalation that neither side wishes to climb, but that becomes harder to avoid as conventional forces suffer losses and military objectives remain unmet. The scenario might end in several ways, including a negotiated settlement that leaves Taiwan's status ambiguous, a Chinese victory that fundamentally alters the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, or an American success in repelling the invasion, but at costs so high that the sustainability of American commitments across the globe comes into question. A second scenario envisions simultaneous crises in multiple regions, testing American capacity to respond to concurrent threats. The year is 2032, and the United States faces a coordinated challenge from adversaries who have observed the Taiwan scenario and concluded that American forces cannot be everywhere at once. Russia launches a limited operation against the Baltic states, using hybrid warfare techniques including cyber attacks, information operations, and unmarked special forces to seize key infrastructure and present NATO with a fait accompli designed to split the alliance between members willing to risk war and those seeking accommodation. China applies pressure on the Philippines and Vietnam over disputed territories in the South China Sea, using Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia to occupy features and establish facts on the ground while remaining below the threshold that would trigger American treaty obligations. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz using mines, anti-ship missiles, and swarms of small boats, disrupting global oil markets and threatening to draw the United States into another Middle Eastern conflict. North Korea conducts a nuclear test and threatens South Korea with artillery and missile strikes, demanding recognition as a nuclear power and the end of the American alliance with Seoul. Each crisis individually might be manageable with American forces able to deter or defeat any single adversary, but the simultaneity of the challenges exceeds American capacity to respond effectively to all of them at once. Carrier strike groups can only be in one place at a time, and moving forces to confront one threat means accepting risk in other regions. Munitions stockpiles already strained by years of conflict in the Taiwan scenario have not been fully replenished due to industrial capacity limits and budget constraints. Allied forces possess capabilities, but lack the capacity for sustained high-intensity operations without American support. The scenario forces strategic choices about priorities, with American planners forced to decide which commitments are truly vital and which can be conceded or managed through diplomacy and sanctions rather than military force. The multi-front crisis reveals a fundamental tension in American grand strategy between global commitments and finite resources. For decades, the United States military has planned to fight and win two major regional conflicts simultaneously, a standard that drove force structure and readiness levels. But budget realities and the increased capabilities of adversaries have made this standard increasingly aspirational rather than actual. The National Defense Strategy now speaks of integrated deterrence and campaigning, concepts that envision preventing conflicts through forward presence and partnerships rather than fighting them after they begin. But the effectiveness of deterrence depends on credible capability and will to respond to challenges. If adversaries believe that American forces are overstretched and that the American public lacks the appetite for sustained conflict, deterrence weakens and opportunism increases. The scenario might conclude with the United States successfully managing all the crises through a combination of limited military action, diplomatic engagement, and economic pressure, demonstrating that American power remains sufficient to maintain global order. Alternatively, it might expose the limits of American capacity and lead to a retrenchment where the United States focuses on core interests in selected regions while accepting reduced influence elsewhere. A shift that would represent the most significant change in American grand strategy since World War II. Looking toward 2040, the character of warfare may change in ways that favor or undermine American advantages depending on how emerging technologies develop and which nations master them first. Artificial intelligence enables autonomous weapon systems that can identify, track, and engage targets without human intervention, potentially achieving speeds of decision-making and action that overwhelm traditional command structures. Hypersonic missiles travel at speeds exceeding 5 times the speed of sound and maneuver unpredictably, making them nearly impossible to intercept with current defensive systems and compressing warning times to minutes or seconds. Directed energy weapons, including high-powered lasers and microwave systems, offer the potential for magazine depth limited only by power generation rather than physical munitions, potentially revolutionizing air and missile defense. Quantum computing could break the encryption that protects military communications and networks, forcing a complete redesign of cybersecurity architecture. Biotechnology might enable new forms of warfare targeting specific populations or degrading military effectiveness through engineered pathogens below the threshold of traditional biowarfare. Space-based weapons could strike targets anywhere on Earth within minutes of a decision to launch. Swarms of autonomous drones could saturate defenses and conduct reconnaissance or strike missions at costs a fraction of manned aircraft. Each of these technologies presents opportunities for maintaining American military advantages, but also risks that adversaries might achieve breakthroughs that render existing American capabilities obsolete or ineffective. The nation that masters these technologies and integrates them effectively into military operations will hold enormous advantages, but the outcome is not predetermined. China is investing heavily in artificial intelligence, hypersonics, and quantum computing, matching or exceeding American spending in some areas. Russia has demonstrated hypersonic weapons in combat operations and maintains sophisticated cyber and electronic warfare capabilities despite a smaller overall defense budget. Even smaller powers can access some of these technologies through commercial markets or cyber espionage, potentially leveling the playing field in ways that favor attackers over defenders and small agile actors over large bureaucratic militaries. The economic dimension of military competition will prove increasingly important, as defense spending must compete with domestic priorities in democracies where populations expect both security and prosperity. The United States currently spends approximately $800 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 nations combined. But this figure represents only 3 to 4% of gross domestic product compared to 6% or higher during the Cold War. Increasing defense spending to Cold War levels would require adding $600 billion or more annually, politically difficult in an era of large deficits, growing entitlement obligations, and competing demands for infrastructure, education, and healthcare spending. China's defense spending is officially around $230 billion annually, but may be significantly higher when accounting for activities not included in the public budget. And more importantly, China's economy continues to grow while producing weapon systems and personnel at lower costs than the United States. If current trends continue, China's economy will surpass America's in size sometime in the 2030s, and its defense spending could match or exceed American spending in absolute terms by the 2040s, while representing a smaller percentage of overall economic output. The question becomes whether the United States can maintain military dominance while spending a smaller share of a larger economy against competitors spending a larger share of rapidly growing economies, and whether the American political system can sustain the level of investment needed when the public sees domestic needs going unmet. History suggests that great powers decline not because they lack resources, but because they lack the political will to allocate sufficient resources to defense when competing with internal demands and when the threats seem distant or abstract. The Soviet Union collapsed despite having nuclear weapons and a large military, because its economic system could not sustain both military competition and basic prosperity for its population. The British Empire contracted after World War II despite winning the conflict because the costs of global commitments exceeded British capacity to sustain them while rebuilding at home. The United States faces less severe economic constraints than either of these examples, but must make strategic choices about where and how to allocate finite resources in a more competitive international environment than at any time since the Cold War ended. By 2050, the international system may have evolved into a genuine multipolar order where the United States remains the strongest single power, but can no longer unilaterally shape outcomes in every region of the globe. China, if it continues its economic growth and military modernization, could achieve regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, an outcome that would force the United States to either accept reduced influence or risk conflict on terms increasingly favorable to Beijing. Russia may have declined further due to demographic collapse and economic stagnation, but could remain a spoiler power capable of causing problems in its near abroad, even if incapable of projecting power globally. India, with a population exceeding 1.4 billion and an economy that could be among the world's 3 largest, may emerge as a great power in its own right, with military capabilities to match its economic weight. Europe might finally develop meaningful military capabilities independent of the United States, or might continue to free ride on American security guarantees while spending minimal resources on defense. Regional powers including Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, and others could assert themselves in their neighborhoods, complicating American ability to impose preferred outcomes. The proliferation of advanced technologies will give more nations the ability to challenge American forces at least within their regions, raising the costs of intervention and making the calculation of when to employ military force more difficult. Non-state actors could possess capabilities once limited to major powers, including cyber weapons, drones, and potentially even weapons of mass destruction, creating security challenges that cannot be addressed through traditional military dominance. The scenarios and trends outlined do not point to an inevitable decline of American military power, but rather to an environment in which dominance is more contested, more expensive, and more difficult to sustain than during the unipolar moment that followed the Cold War. The question is not whether the United States will remain a major military power, because barring catastrophic internal collapse it will, but whether it can maintain the gap in capabilities that allows it to deter or defeat any adversary with confidence, to project power globally with minimal risk, and to shape international outcomes according to American preferences across multiple regions simultaneously. Maintaining this level of dominance would require sustained investments in military modernization at levels that test political will and economic capacity. It would require rebuilding industrial capacity to produce munitions, ships, and equipment at rates sufficient for sustained high-intensity conflict. It would require maintaining alliances that increasingly see their interests diverging from American priorities and that face their own domestic pressures to reduce defense spending and avoid conflicts. It would require mastering emerging technologies and integrating them into operations faster than adversaries can do the same. It would require addressing demographic challenges to recruit and retain sufficient personnel for a global military presence. It would require economic growth that generates the resources to fund both military power and domestic needs without forcing impossible choices. It would require political consensus that proves difficult to sustain in divided democracies, where immediate domestic concerns often override long-term strategic imperatives. None of these requirements is impossible, but achieving all of them simultaneously over decades represents a challenge that no nation in history has successfully met indefinitely. The alternatives to sustained dominance are not necessarily catastrophic, because a world in which the United States remains the strongest power but not utterly dominant could still be relatively stable and prosperous. A more multipolar international system might actually prove more stable than a unipolar one by creating multiple centers of power that check each other, and by forcing greater burden sharing among allied nations. The risks of multipolarity include increased potential for miscalculation, arms races driven by security competition, and the absence of a single power capable of providing global public goods like freedom of navigation and nuclear non-proliferation. History suggests that transitions between international orders are particularly dangerous periods when rising powers challenge established powers, when treaty commitments are tested, and when wars can begin through accidents and miscalculations as much as through deliberate aggression. The next 25 years will likely determine whether the transition from American dominance to something else occurs peacefully through managed adjustment or through the kind of catastrophic conflict that has marked previous power transitions. The choices made by American leaders about defense spending, alliance management, and strategic priorities matter enormously, as do the choices made by Chinese leaders about how aggressively to pursue their interests, and by other powers about whether to bandwagon with rising powers or balance against them. The sun sets over the same South China Sea where this analysis began, and the carrier strike group that was conducting freedom of navigation operations has returned to port. The pilots are debriefed, the ships are refueled and rearmed, and the cycle begins again tomorrow. This is the routine of military dominance in the early 21st century: constant presence, vigilant readiness, and the projection of power that deters aggression through the visible demonstration that any challenge will be met with overwhelming force. But beneath this routine, the foundations of American military dominance are being tested in ways both visible and invisible. The submarine that was tracking the carrier has returned to its base with data on American operations that will be analyzed and incorporated into Chinese planning. The satellites that passed overhead have transmitted images that reveal patterns and vulnerabilities. The cyber probes that constantly test American networks have found weaknesses that will be exploited when needed. The industrial plants in China are producing ships and missiles at rates that narrow the capability gap with each passing month. The economic growth that funds Chinese military modernization continues while American defense budgets face pressure from competing priorities. The alliances that multiplied American power show signs of strain as members question costs and commitments. The technologies that have underwritten American advantages face challenges from innovations that could make stealth obsolete, precision strikes vulnerable, and networks penetrable. The personnel who operate and maintain the most sophisticated military in history must be recruited from a population where fewer are qualified and interested each year. The munition stockpiles that would be depleted in days or weeks of high-intensity conflict cannot be replaced fast enough to sustain prolonged operations. The question posed at the beginning remains unanswered because the answer depends on choices not yet made and developments not yet determined, but the stakes could not be higher. If the United States can adapt to the changing character of warfare, can mobilize the resources needed to maintain capabilities across all domains, can sustain alliances that share burdens and risks, can master emerging technologies before adversaries do, and can demonstrate the will to honor commitments when challenged, then American military dominance can be sustained for decades to come. If these conditions are not met, if adversaries close the capability gap faster than the United States can maintain it, if alliances fracture under pressure, if political will proves insufficient for needed investments, then the era of American dominance will give way to something else, a multipolar competition where outcomes are less certain, where conflicts are more likely, and where the international order that has provided unprecedented prosperity and peace for much of the world faces an uncertain future. The choice ultimately belongs to the American people acting through their elected representatives, deciding how much they value the security and influence that military dominance provides, and whether they are willing to pay the costs in treasure and perhaps blood that maintaining that dominance will require. History will judge whether the decisions made in these years prove sufficient to sustain the most powerful military the world has ever seen, or whether they mark the beginning of a long decline from dominance to mere primacy to something less still, a great power among others, rather than the unquestioned leader of the international system. The story is unwritten, and the outcome remains uncertain, but the direction of travel is increasingly clear, and time to alter course grows shorter with each passing year.